Human populations increased by 1,000-fold. We're more than 7.5 billion today. I think that people hear this and they instantly kind of move to the zone of, well, we're consuming way too much. Like we're consuming like we have 5 planets and we don't. And this is just way too many people. It's like maybe if there was some sort of ethical way for the population to be smaller, we'd have a chance, but we have no chance. I'm gonna give you a slightly different thought process on this. So it turns out that if you take all the biomass of humanity and you add it up, it turns out to be about 350 million tons of humans. And if you do the same thing with ants and you put them all on a scale and add them up, it's about 350 million tons of ants. And so we basically weigh the same. We have the same amount of biomass, but a difference between humans and ants is humans eat 3% of their body weight per day, 2.8 if you're really counting, and ants eat about 30% of their body weight per day, which means that ants eat 10 times more of the planet than us every single day. But we're not sitting around thinking like, oh my God, ant overpopulation, it's destroying the planet, they're eating 10 times more than us, those bastards. No, we're just kind of like, oh, ants, they're pretty cool. I mean, unless you have fire ants in your yard, but whatever. Now, why do we think that? It's actually because ants follow a really simple rule. They provide more ecosystem services than they do, than they take via ecosystem consumption. So it's not the absolute amount because as you can see from the stats up here, ants literally eat 10 times more of the planet than us every day. And they're a pretty good analogy because they're a social organism, they're omnivores. This isn't even a vegetarian thing. This is like, they really go on and eat 10 times more than us. So the reason that we don't freak out about that is not because of the amount, it's the style. Because basically ants eat 10 times more of us, but in a style that produces more ecosystem services than ecosystem consumption. And us, eating 10 times less, somehow do it in a style that's extremely damaging. So it raises a really simple question: how do we become more like ants? And actually, all of life follows this rule of providing more ecosystem services than consumption. So how do we follow the rule of all of life and become a net positive to nature? So if you want to understand, humanity as a potential net positive to nature, you got to understand where we are right now. Does this laser work? Oh, it kind of does very weakly. Okay, so if you start over on the left-hand side of the graph, this is basically us at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. We had 280 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And through the burning of coal, oil, gas, creating some cement and changing the way that we use the land, then we basically had the effect of a net emission into the ecosystem. Now, if that had been all that had happened with humans, then it would already be over. We'd already be at 570, 580 parts per million for anybody who's counting. But luckily, we weren't alone. The ecosystem was there, and the ecosystem absorbed 582 gigatons into the ocean, almost 650 into the land, and then the rest is still hanging out in the atmosphere, which is why we're around 410 parts per million in the atmosphere. Now, what's left up there is about 1 trillion tons of stuff that's in the wrong place. And even though the ecosystem has already helped us by pulling down over 1.2 trillion. It hasn't been all a perfect story because the 582 gigatons that went into the ocean also increased the acidity of the ocean by 30%. The stuff that went into the land was mostly vegetation, soils, wetlands. It's actually kind of fine. And then the 410, the trillion tons that's left up in the atmosphere that's gotten us up to 410 parts per million, that is basically leading to large-scale climate destabilization. And I use the word climate destabilization instead of climate change because I think it's way more accurate. And I think that we fooled ourselves for a long time by talking about average increases in temperature and average sea level rise, because basically the volatility is going to increase much faster than the average. So we'll experience this as destabilization much faster than we experience it as a slight average change in temperature. Okay. Now, given everything's kind of screwy and we're not even close to becoming a net positive to nature, how do we try to become net positive to nature? Well, in order to go understand that, you need to understand a different concept that I learned from my career. I was one of the founding team members of Google X, where I worked on the self-driving car, Google Glass, Project Loon. That's a contact lens that measures your glucose levels. This is, a VTOL craft that can deliver matter anywhere on Earth. That's new approach to artificial intelligence based off semi-supervised learning. But presentation's not about those things. You can look that stuff up. What I learned in the time working there was this idea of an invention catalyst. An invention catalyst is different than just a better invention. Like you think about a mousetrap and a better mousetrap, maybe the better mousetrap is 20% cheaper or 10% more lethal, if that's what your definition of good is. And then, a regular invention makes the regular thing a little bit better at being what it is. But invention catalyst is something that comes on the scene, which both requests and sometimes forces the redoing of an entire system. So, for example, something like the self-driving car, right now we have about 4% utilization of our cars. People that own cars drive them about 4% of the time. They leave them parked 96% of the time. If we had self-driving cars, we could make the average utilization of a car jump from 4% to 40%. And if you have 10 times more utilization of each car, you can have roughly 10 times fewer cars. 10 times fewer cars, imagine New York City with 10 times fewer cars. San Francisco in the afternoon with 10 times fewer cars. You actually get to redesign the city. And we used to joke in the group that once self-driving cars reached a particular level of penetration in the world, we would go around to all the cities, find all the signs that said parking lot, and erase the trailing letters to just say the word park. Because effectively, you can redesign cities, you can redesign all of transportation if you go change this one invention, because it has a catalytic effect. Now, if that's what an invention catalyst is generally, what does it look like to take an invention catalyst into the realm of becoming a net positive to nature? And I'm an investor. I'm launching a fund. I've invested in 15 such things already. Here's one of them. So this is tree planting drones. Each one of the drones can plant 120 trees per minute at 1/10 the cost it currently takes to plant. You can see we're already out there planting. That's Susan, the CEO, looking over our mycelial mixes that go into our pods. That's Arena out in the field with a 2.5-foot tall mangrove because we did extensive mangrove restoration in southern Myanmar. And we've planted over 10 million so far. And if you're able to go plant 100 times faster and 10 times cheaper, what is the catalytic effect that's possible there? Well, if you remember that trillion-ton debt in the atmosphere, well, it turns out that a tree, when it grows up, it actually sequesters a bunch of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Actually, almost the entire mass of a tree comes from the air. More than 95% of the mass of a tree comes from the air. And more than half of the mass of a tree is carbon. So given that, if an average tree weighs 2 to 20 tons, and you could plant 1 trillion 2-ton trees, and each one of them sequestered a ton of carbon each, then that would actually fully pay off the trillion-ton debt that we've accrued in the atmosphere since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So this is not just about stopping emissions. This is not about getting to 1990 levels. This is about let's erase the stuff that we did all the way back to the Industrial Revolution. And if we get there, we actually should keep going and get the planet to the place where it was before agriculture. But that's in a second. Okay, now, cool. What could you do if you had this sort of catalyst? Well, already 25 of our drones can plant 1 million trees in 5 hours. So that's a thing that was not possible before. So now that's possible. You can make different decisions in the presence of that being possible. And if you wanted to plant 1 trillion trees and you wanted to do it in 50 years, so that's 20 billion per year, then it would only take about 9,000 drones and 450 staff and $80 million in operating budget. So this is excluding seed costs, because seed costs can be like 100 per penny, or it could be $1 per seed, but whatever, depends on the seed. Would throw out the input costs, but the operating cost for that's only 80 million a year. And you run it for a couple decades and you have your 1 trillion trees. So this is way cheaper than, we have single hurricanes that do $100 billion, $150 billion in damage. The fact that you could basically not have climate change for a fraction of the amount that a single hurricane costs it's a catalyst. We can do something with that. All right, now I got to finish the thing because I got less than 1 minute left. And like I said, I'm an investor in a bunch of invention catalysts. So I'll just do a quickie. So there's some cell agriculture there. This is robotic agriculture. So this basically does, this robot does organic agriculture from seed to harvest with no human input. And up there, that's basically some chicken grown from chicken cells. And a thing that I didn't talk about is we spend 40% of the land surface of the earth to feed ourselves between animal and plant agriculture. And that's the main disruptor for the natural ecosystem. So we're not cutting down the rainforest for timber. We actually burn down the rainforest. We don't even bother with the timber. Only like low single digit extraction goes to timber in the Amazon. Most of the Amazon's getting burned down for soybeans and cattle, which is fully to feed ourselves. right? So we could go from 40% of the land surface of the Earth being used to feed ourselves to less than 1% of the land surface of the Earth used to feed ourselves with the stuff on the right-hand side over there. I need to finish soon. I'm at 0 minutes. So on the left-hand side, there's a 3D printer. They just won their NSF grant because they basically invented a 3D printer that can take household trash, you thresh it up, and you can basically recycle the stuff directly. So it creates a new sort of waste stream. You don't need to go all the way to the recycling center and back. You basically do it at the household level. I don't know, man, restoring coral reefs, reducing this membrane is part of a air conditioner that has 99.7% less greenhouse gas impact. So refrigerants basically is the industrial chemical that we use that has the largest greenhouse gas impact per kilogram. And refrigerants as a class have as much greenhouse gas impact as all of cars combined. So if you could use a refrigerator / air conditioning approach that has 99.7% less greenhouse gas impact, it's like taking all the cars off the road with one invention. So whatever, there's more stuff. Everything's cool. Questions? I just learned I'm going to live forever, and robots are not going to take my job. Even though I make robots that take people's jobs, I learned that's not a thing.
Great talk, as usual. Never disappointing. Question from the speakers.
Your idea about Invention Catalyst is a neat idea, but if you're going to cost your trillion trees, you have to allow for the land they're occupying, which is land that the people who are now there may want to use for crops or houses or any other things. So really, it ought to be the sum of your planting costs plus whatever the value in other uses is of the land those trillion trees occupy.
That's also why you need to destroy agriculture. So that's also part of the plan. Yes, keep going.
Did you want to say something, Jessica, Zarina? No? Okay.
I just have two questions. I apologize if I missed something, but where are these trees going to be planted? And then the other thing is, I read that actually trees are closer to having a neutral impact on carbon because all the bacteria that live on the trees create carbon dioxide. So I was wondering if you could address that.
If you can add net biomass to the planet, then it's definitely a carbon reduction from the atmosphere. And this is why when we deforest areas, it counts as a carbon emission. Now, that said, trees do die, they do decay, and in the decay process, they turn back into carbon dioxide, methane, that kind of thing. But also, while they're living, trees plant a couple more trees. So as a ecosystem gets to full gross plant productivity, it actually represents stored biomass that has long-term storage value. And as it has a soil interaction, it basically synthesizes soil to this substance that's called humin, H-U-M-I-N. And it's basically very long-term carbon storage in healthy soils.